Well, thank you very much, Kyla. And first of all, I will say, not quite apologies, but I have managed for the first time in over a year to pick up a boring, ordinary cold. So if I start sneezing and spluttering, apologies. I'm hoping my voice will hold up, but just in case, I might have to take a break to have a cough sweet. So, on to the business of the evening. I've entitled this talk, What Did the Tyburn Ever Do for Us? I'm now going to start screen sharing, and hopefully you will begin to see what the answer is to my question. Right, so you should all be seeing the title slide, and this is going to be a guided historical walk following the last 3 miles of the course of the River Tyburn. We're going to look at the impact of the course of the river that it makes on the ground today, and explore some of the history associated with the river. And yes, we will be visiting the palace. That is not just an eye-catching slide, it's a real place we need to talk about. Well, Jenny and I did this walk, about half of it at least, as a guided tour of English heritage in 2018, which was my sort of point of departure for it. Our abiding memory, though, is it was on the last really bad day of the Beast from the East then, and of battling across Green Park in the teeth of a freezing blizzard. And it was more like being with Scott in the Antarctic than being with a tour guide in a central London park. Now, changing tack slightly, we need to understand that our Tyburn today is not the Tyburn that gave its name to the Tyburn tree, which is where the gallows were, where Marble Arch now stands. That site is named after the Tyburn Brook, which is a tributary of the River Westbourne. I do also need to say a word here about the images to follow, particularly as we're being recorded. Most of them are from Google Maps and Google Earth Street View, and Google allows this use of their material, for which I am deeply indebted to them. Most of the other images come from Wikipedia, to whom again many thanks. Now let's move on and have a look at the Tyburn itself. So this is the course of the river. And this puts it in the context of the other lost rivers to the west of the City of London. So the Tyburn's in the middle, flowing down to the Thames. To its east, we've got the River Fleet, and to its west, we have the River Westbourne, which goes through Hyde Park and then joins the Thames further south. The Tyburn itself is about 7 miles long, and it runs from Hampstead Heath down to the River Thames, and it rises in 2 springs on Hampstead Heath, and they merge south of the heath. So that's Hampstead Heath, that's where they merge. And then it flows entirely underground through Hampstead, St John's Wood, Regent's Park and Marylebone. And that's where a second stream joins it at Baker Street. It then continues into Mayfair, round Buckingham Palace, through Westminster, and then to join the Thames at Vauxhall Bridge. So this map shows you all that route down to Vauxhall Bridge. But you'll also see that it indicates that the river once split into a delta just south of Buckingham Palace. There's Buckingham Palace. And just south of Buckingham Palace, you can see what was originally a marshy delta. And we'll have a lot more to say about that in due course when we reach Buckingham Palace. A couple of other preliminary things. There are 2 suggested origins for the actual name Tyburn. Burn, of course, means stream, but Ty could refer either to the river having 2 sources or to it being used as a boundary marker for an apparently very obscure Anglo-Saxon word. I did have a look at boundaries that use this river, and there aren't very many of them. There is one boundary we'll see, which is an estate boundary in Mayfair, and the southernmost part of the river seems to be a parish boundary. But the area to the south of Hampstead Heath, so this whole area here, was actually called Tyburn Manor, and the river flows straight to the middle of it, not using it as a boundary. So I suspect it's to do with the number of sources. Now the river is not now and never has been navigable. It was possible to get small boats or canoes into parts of it, even before it was put entirely underground. Nevertheless, there are some Victorian accounts of bold explorers claiming to have negotiated several miles of it underground, and even in parts that were then by then a sewer. Well, rest easy, we're not going to have a go at that today. Now, until the early modern period, it was an important source of drinking water to the west of the City of London. But from the 18th century onwards, it was realistically only a sewer and a storm drain. Another little health warning: as ever with historical research in central London, there's an absolute mass of sometimes contradictory information, alternating with some surprising gaps. Of course, there's absolutely no natural landscape left we can study to make any comments about the river from it. So I would ask you to bear with me if I leave things out you were hoping to hear, choose an interpretation you don't agree with, or if when you double check I've simply got some things wrong. It's like that with research in this part of the world. Now we're going to do this as a virtual walk shortly, and that will be starting at Baker Street Station on Marylebone Road. And for those of you who want to follow on a map, the postcode is NW1 5LJ. So if you want to get your map out, that's the postcode to start with. Now, before we start from Baker Street, though, I wanted to look at three things that are happening to the north of Baker Street, even though there's nothing much to see on the ground of the river until you get to Marylebone. Now, the first feature is a plaque on Fitzjohn's Avenue in Hampstead, marking the site of the Shepherd's Well. This is where water from the Tyburn was fed into a well open to the public. And then few residents in that part of Hampstead drew their water from it, but its great claim to fame is that it proved Dr. John Snow's theories about the transmission of cholera, and thus it played a major role in the development and acceptance of the science of epidemiology. Now, I'll explain how this happened. It came about in the 1854 cholera epidemic in Soho. The disease was rampant in Soho. A lot of people died there, but no one else was catching it anywhere else in London. And there was one lady in Hampstead who insisted she did not like the taste of the water from a shepherd's well. She had her water supply for drinking water fetched for her from the Broadway pump in Soho. And she was then the only person in Hampstead to contract cholera. And this gave John Snow his definitive proof that cholera was a waterborne infection, and that its source and the source of the infected water was that pump in Broadway. Now, the second thing I want to look at is how the river crosses the Regent's Canal. And this canal runs around the whole of the north side of Regent's Park. Regent's Park itself was laid out in 1811, and the canal was dug 1812 to 1816. So the river has to cross the canal. So the canal's flowing east-west, the river's flowing north-south. So the river has to cross the canal and then flow into the park. Now, these pictures show the canal on the left and then the Chalbert footbridge on the right. And it's under the Chalbert footbridge, which is this footbridge here, that the river actually flows. But there are two versions of how that happened. There's an official version, which is that the river is in a tunnel underneath the canal. Now, you might think that would make it far too deep, but actually canals are only about 3 feet deep, so the tunnel would only need to be about 4 feet underground. Now, the unofficial version is that Chalbert Bridge is also an aqueduct carrying the river over the canal in a pipe. But whichever it is, the river is flowing under the asphalt path that you see here coming away from Chalbert Bridge. Now, there is a lost river of London that does flow through an aqueduct, but you can all go and see if you want to. And here it is in Sloane Square Station. And the River Westbourne is piped through the station. And I want you to hang on to this image for a couple of minutes because it'll come back into play in a moment. Now, the other feature I want to talk about was the boating lake in Regent's Park. And some of you may look at this map and think, I've spotted the Tyburn. It's behaving the same way as the Westbourne, and the Westbourne is dammed here, just north of Knightsbridge, and the water then turns into the Serpentine Lake. But no, in fact, it's a different story in Regent's Park. The river was not dammed. The river flows in a tunnel down the west side of the lake, but the connection with the lake is that when the lake was first dug, back at the beginning of the 19th century, water from the Tyburn was used to fill it. But that didn't last very long because the water rapidly became too fetid and polluted for that to last. Now, there is nothing else to see between, there's the lake and say, the river flowing in a tunnel around it. There was nothing else to see until we get to Baker Street. And this is where we can start following the course of the Tyburn through Marylebone. This is the first part of the course where we can see the river's effect on the layout of the streets above it. Now, the river runs to the west of Marylebone Station. Oh, sorry, Marathon. Sorry, of Baker Street Station. So there's the station we've just been looking at. Here's Baker Street running north-south, and the river's running along the western side of Baker Street. But you will have realised it has to cross the railway line. And it does that the same way that the Westbourne crosses the over the district and circle lines at Sloane Square. But unlike at Sloane Square, the pipe that carries the Tyburn is in deep darkness, and you can never actually see it, so I can't show it to you. Now we're going to carry on until we get to Blandford Street, which is where this arrow is here. And at Blandford Street, we're now following the river, taking a turn to the east, and we will then reach the end of Marylebone Lane. Now, those of you who've got a map open will immediately see that in all that part of Marylebone, Marylebone Lane is the only road which isn't part of a grid pattern of streets, but is a windy lane. And it's winding because it picks up the course of a Tyburn, which is flowing underneath the middle of the road. And to show you how this works, prove it, there's a little plaque at Marylebone Lane, which will be posted on the internet, showing you that the river does indeed flow underneath it. Now here we have a bend in the river, and we will follow its course along. Just mixed up here. Bear with me a moment. We'll follow its course along through the bends, and you can see the curves and sweeps of the river. We reach a sharper bend here as we're about to get to Whitmore Street. And there we are, almost at Whitmore Street with the last bend we can see. And here we have Whitmore Street. Now, this is the last place where the River Tyburn was seen in the open air, albeit very briefly. And it was on the 16th of February, 1941, when a bomb fell in the road, blew the road surface off, and people could see water flowing to the bottom of the crater. And that water was indeed the River Tyburn. Now, here, the river stops following Marylebone Lane, goes under, just go back there, goes underneath the building opposite, and fetches up in Stratford Place opposite. And that's the map showing where Stratford Place is, and there's Marylebone Lane still going off slightly to the east. So we're in this little stretch of road here, north of Bond Street Station. Now, Stratford Place is a very important site for the river. Here it is today, because in 1238, the City of London bought the rights to the water here and installed an underground conduit to take most of it to the City of London via what are now Conduit Street, Trafalgar Square, the Strand, and Fleet Street. And the city marked this venture by building a banqueting house, again, in what is now Stratford Place. Now, the banqueting house was demolished in 1730, and here's a picture of the area from about 1750. And you can see the river running through it. It's here. And a lot of these little buildings are what are called conduit houses. So they housed sluice gates and control mechanisms for directing the water. And the reason for that is that between the Middle Ages and the 19th century, a really big problem was the theft of drinking water. And that's why conduits and sluices are put safely underground, protected usually by brickwork. Well, the conduit here ceased to be so important after 1613, when the new river was opened to bring a much greater volume of fresh water from Hertfordshire to the north of the city. The flow of the Tyburn, however, was never restored to its pre-1238 level. On a quite separate, well, not quite separate theme, but I recall a few years ago that Peter Aylmer led us on a walk along the new river, showing how that drinking water supply was secured in the 17th century. Now, the Elizabethan antiquarian John Stowe described this conduit and what was going on here in 1598. And he said the pipes of the conduit had always been made of lead, which is quite impressive for 1238, and that a small village called Tyburn had grown up round the waterworks and the banqueting house. He reported that the conduit was, quote, for the good of the realm, unquote, and, quote, for the poor to drink and for the rich to dress their meat, unquote. There's actually more information in these words than you might think. The first obvious inference is that the City of London made the water available free of charge as a philanthropic project. But this would have a sting in its tail, because the second inference is that the water was already of very poor quality, fit for washing down carcasses after slaughter, and fit only for poor people to drink as charity, and not fit for consumption by people with the money to buy cleaner water. We then cross Oxford Street, so we've reached here, there's Bond Street Station, and we're crossing over Oxford Street to come into Mayfair. The river flows under the buildings here, so we can't follow it directly on the ground, and we need to move along South Moulton Street and pick it up slightly further south. We'll also be crossing over Brook Street, which is there, and Brook Street is named after the Tyburn, and we'll come across the name Brook again in the future. And we're going to meet the composer George Handel for the first time here, because in Brook Street, George Handel lived at number 23, and then 2 centuries later, his next door neighbour, another musical theme, was Jimi Hendrix. And our guide said he thought that Jimi Hendrix had actually listened to some of Handel's music when he realised that they were, although 2 centuries apart, next door neighbours. And number 25, by the way, still has a music academy in it. Sorry, I got those addresses the wrong way around. That's 23 in George Handel, that's 25 in Jimi Hendrix. So 23 still has a musical connection to it. There is, though, before we leave this part of Mayfair, one little local connection I need to share with you. This is the very fine Gray's Antique Emporium. Now, I do recommend a visit if you haven't been there. It's a marvellous place to rummage around in. But it does have a water feature in its basement, this feature here. A lot of websites will tell you that this is the actual River Tyburn diverted through its basement as a feature. In fact, it's not, but it is the same sort of size and shape that the Tyburn would have been, and the Tyburn runs at the same level underground in the street outside it. Now we now continue on into Mayfair, and we're going to pick up the river again here just after Brook Street, and we're going to go into Avery Row. Now this is another little road which shows the winding river with the road built on top. It also shows how narrow the river had become after 1238 here. This is the width of the river, so it's just a little stream that's running down there. Also in this part of Mayfair, if you do get down on your hands and knees and peer down manhole covers, checking there's no traffic coming, you can often see some water through the grill at the top of the manhole cover, and that water will usually be the River Tyburn. And this is the only part of London where you can actually still see it if you know exactly where to look and if the flow's good enough on the right day. Well, after Avery Row, we move on into Bruton Place, and we then move to the Bruton Lane. And this is another lane that's got a very winding route following the course of the river. And it's the only street we're going to see where the river was used as a boundary between two land holdings. So on the left or east side of this picture is land owned by the City of London, and on the right, the west side, is the Grosvenor Estate, and it's still the Grosvenor Estate today. Now we move along down Bruton Lane, and this building here, a very fine building on the left, actually has a boundary marker on it, describing that boundary between the two estates. And at the southern end of Bruton Lane was quite a sharp turn, which takes us towards Barkley Square, where I hope you're all trying to listen out for the nightingales, because we go round the south end of Berkeley Square and go into Lansdowne Row, another very narrow little road with the river flowing immediately underneath it. Now, Lansdowne Row leads into Curzon Street, which is the street here, and the river's flowing really where that white arrow is under the street here. And we follow Curzon Street along a bit until it has to make, till the river, has to make a very sharp left-hand turn southwards into an alleyway off Curzon Street, and which is unfortunately hidden behind this van that was parked here when Google Street View did its photography. But you can see that there's an alleyway which we're going to go into now. Whoops, and there it is. So that's going into that alleyway, and we're heading due south now with the river running under this pavement. And we're going further on into an area called Shepherd Market. and we get to the central part of Shepherd Market, and just need to say a few words about Shepherd Market. This is nothing to do with sheep. Shepherd Market is named after Edward Shepherd, who built a very posh housing estate here between 1735 and 1746. But he built his housing estate on an area called Brook Field, named Brook, named after River Tyburn. And the Tyburn flows down the eastern side of this central market area. Now, the market area, or the Brook Field he built the housing estate on, had been the site of the fair each May for selling horses. So it's the May Fair, and that gives its name to the whole area. However, it's not one of the traditional medieval markets in London. It was chartered in the reign of James II, so it was quite a short-lived horse fair, even though the name's very long-lived. The other thing I'll say is this area, right from day one, gained a reputation for upmarket prostitution. So I think we'll move quickly on, and we leave Shepherd Market. Down the last street we're going to see with a distinct river bend in it. Now, this is White Horse Street, and at the end of White Horse Street we come out facing Green Park. So there we are looking out across Piccadilly, and someone's going to ask me what the origin of the name Piccadilly is. So I had to look this up for another walk I did a couple of years ago, and it comes from the name of a fashionable early 17th century collar called a piccadille. And in the early 17th century, this area of London had a lot of tailoring establishments in it, and it's where the piccadilles were made, and that's how the name derived and got stuck. Now we go across Green Park, following a sort of slight, it's not very obvious here, but there's a slight dip in the land, and the river more or less follows the course of this path here, going due south across Green Park. Now, Green Park was acquired by Charles II to be a royal park in 1668. It was landscaped to create the scenery we see here today in 1820, and that's when the by then very fetid river was put underground in a tunnel through it. Now we meet George Handel again here, but this time he hasn't got Jimi Hendrix with him. In 1748, Britain had been on the winning side at the end of the War of Austrian Succession, and George II commissioned Handel to compose a celebratory work of music. This became the music for the royal fireworks. It is performed on the banks of the Tyburn as part of the victory celebrations in Green Park, with their climax in a massive firework display on the evening of the 27th of April, 1749. Right, well, we now come across Green Park, it's behind us, and we're looking at Buckingham Palace from the north, the Green Park sort of to our back. Now the river flowed in front of the palace, roughly just in front of where those railings are, and then around the roundabout. And I'll see you saying more about that in a moment. Now, say more about this. This was originally Buckingham House, and it was built in 1703. It didn't become Buckingham Palace until 1761. And by the way, the original house is this bit at the back. This is actually an early 20th century facade that was put on there. So it's quite a deceptive building. And it was built by the Duke of Buckingham. Now, the good news in 1703 is that the open sewer that ran in front of Buckingham House was put into a tunnel. The bad news is that the tunnel leaked. Now, by the time Queen Victoria moved into Buckingham Palace in 1837, the sewage was seeping into the cellars, and the cellars housed the royal kitchens. Now, some of you may have watched ITV's recent historical drama Victoria, and remember that the sewage in the kitchens was a recurrent theme in the early episodes, and that script was entirely historically accurate. You may ask yourself, why on earth would the Queen want to live in a polluted palace which was a public health hazard? And the answer to that question is because of her mother, the Duchess of Kent. She and her mother had lived cheek by jowl in the much smaller palace at Kensington before Victoria's accession, and her mother had tried to control every aspect of Victoria's life. Victoria moved immediately on accession to the much larger Buckingham Palace and installed herself at one end and her mother at the other end, and then announced that they were too far apart to be able to see much of each other. The smell of sewage was a small price to pay to be rid of an interfering mother she could no longer stand. Now, the Tyburn is a sewer, as I said, ran around the front of Buckingham House, went off to the south. Now, it's now called, if you ever want to look this up, the King's Scholars Pond Sewer. And that name is with it all the way from Baker Street to the Thames. And I'm going to come back to how that name is picked up in a moment. Now, let's have a look at what's actually going on in the original landscape here. So here we are at Buckingham Palace at the end of the arrow, and you'll see on this slightly larger map that we are looking at a delta with three arms running off to the south. And the delta runs roughly from where Westminster Bridge is today here, to where Vauxhall Bridge is today down here. The area in the middle was a swampy delta, except for this area here called Thorney Island, which was slightly higher ground, slightly drier, and we'll see what use that was put to very shortly. The other thing to bear in mind is the Thames is a tidal river, and it has a 15-foot tidal range. So by the time that we're getting to this part of the river, there's a lot of fresh water coming in at high tide from this delta end. It's probably why it was a delta in the first place. So there's lots of clean fresh water in the Middle Ages coming up the river and towards probably as far as about Buckingham Palace. So what I'm going to do now before I explore Thorney Island in more detail is just complete the story of where the current river come sewer goes to. And here we are with Buckingham Palace up here, and the sewer runs roughly down under Victoria Station and the bus station outside. Then it moves slightly across and goes to the west of Vauxhall Bridge Road and fetches up in the Thames. Now, this is the only surviving branch of the delta, and I think that's been the case since at least the 18th century. There's no point in walking this because there's absolutely nothing to see on the ground, with the one possible exception of a street sign which says Brook Street. And here, different websites give different accounts. Some say that's because the river was called Tatchbrook there, but others say it's named after a Victorian property developer who had moved to London from a place called Tatchbrook. Anyway, that's where we are with that one. But I thought you might like to see what it actually looks like today. And this is the river. So the usual quite low flow is in this little channel here, and then it's big enough to accommodate massive amount of storm drainage as needed. Now let's return to Buckingham Palace and have another look at exactly what's happening with that northern branch of the delta. Now a glance at this map might make you think yet again, I spotted the river. It's St James's Park Lake, dammed up. No, it's the same story as in Hyde Park. The water in the lake was originally diverted from the Tyburn, but this isn't the course of the Tyburn at all. Instead, this body of water was originally a straight ornamental canal built on Charles II's instructions, and it ran straight through Horse Guards Parade and all the way to Whitehall. The park was landscaped by Nash in 1826-7, and the straight canal from Charles II's reign was turned into this rather more ornamental curved lake with the island in the middle of it. Now, our guide in 2018 told us, and this is the third musical connection, that Handel's water music was written to be performed on barges on Charles II's ornamental canal. I have to say, I looked this up, and almost every authority says it was first performed on the Thames. But I think our guide's story is so much better, I've included it for you. So let's see where the river goes from here, because it runs round this roundabout, round the end of St James's Park, and then heads off to the south. So it goes, say, round that roundabout, across what today is Birdcage Walk, and that's St James's Park in the background. The lake, unfortunately, you can't see. It's a slight dip over there. And then it comes on into what the streets that are today Petty France and on into Tothill Street. Now, for most of its history, this part of Westminster was in a large open space called Tothill Fields. And there are two features in Tothill Fields we need to pin down, even though both have long since vanished. The first is the King's Scholars Pond. And this was an artificial lake filled by water from the Tyburn, which was used by the school attached to Westminster Abbey. And at the same time when Buckingham House was being built, it's back in 1703, the by then stagnant pond was drained and the water diverted into the new sewer, which was then given the name the King's Scholars Pond Sewer. Now, the second feature we need to account for was known as Long Ditch, and it was a waterway which separated Whitehall from Westminster. And the antiquarian John Stowe recorded having to cross over it to walk between the two palaces in the 1590s. There were still references to the Long Ditch through into the 17th century, but by then it was recorded as being dry. The Long Ditch was several hundred yards long, running inland from the Thames, and certainly into Tothill Street. And my best guess, and all of our rather vague references to it, is that it was an artificial deepening and straightening of the northern branch of the Delta on Edward the Confessor's orders, for reasons that are going to become obvious in a moment. Now we continue to the end of Tothill Street, and we find facing us Westminster Abbey, which is built on Thorney Island. Now the first masonry version of this building was built by Edward the Confessor in 1042, and it was the centre of a state-of-the-art prestige palace and church complex on Thorney Island. And by the way, Thorney Island was named because of the scrub on it. And if you Google Thorney Island, you'll find there are several Thorney Islands in deltas around the coastline, particularly in England. Now, this is an aerial view, courtesy of Google, of Thorney Island, and I've drawn a line around it. Here we are at Westminster Bridge, and then it goes around Parliament Square, along towards Victoria, and it goes south, and then turns east and meets the Thames again, the other side of the park, Victoria Tower Gardens, just south of the Houses of Parliament. But this is nothing compared with the view you get if you consult the archives of the Thorney Island Society. And here we have Thorney Island in its heyday in the early Middle Ages. And let's explain what's going on here. This, I think, is Long Ditch. That was Tothill Street. And you'll see it's been turned into a moat that surrounds the whole of the palace and the Abbey complex. So there it is with bridges across it. John Stowe had to use this bridge in 1598 to cross between Whitehall up there and Westminster here, and then it flows into the Thames here. And bear in mind again the tidal flow. There's an awful lot of water coming in from the river at high tides to maintain this moat. Now, what you've got here is the Abbey, and this is obviously not Edward the Confessor's original one. And then you've got Westminster Palace here, which was a domestic palace built by Edward the Confessor to be very, very handy for Westminster Abbey. Now, the Palace of Westminster over the centuries evolved into being the home of the Houses of Parliament. Now, that's another story for another day, but the key thing for us is that because the Tyburn could have been converted into a moat, it gave a very good defensible position for this palace. And it's because of a Tyburn that the Houses of Parliament are situated where they are today. Now, this moat's been filled in and is now roads, and we'll now just take a quick jump to over here, and we'll walk round Thorney Island on the roads that now are in the filled-in moat. So we're starting on Westminster Bridge, and we're looking towards Parliament Square, and the Houses of Parliament being refurbished here on our left. That's Portcullis House straight ahead. And then we go on to a junction with Whitehall, where we cross over and continue going due west. And here we are on Great George Street, which goes round Parliament Square. And then we go to the western side of Parliament Square, continue there, and that's Westminster Abbey in front of us. Then we turn right, heading west, and that's Church House. This is the road called Broad Sanctuary. And we go along here, and then we turn left, look around the corner, and we go down Great Smith Street. And you'll realise that these are the precincts of the Abbey and the Palace as we walk around them. And here we have Great Smith Street still. Then we turn into Great Peter Street, and St. Peter was the patron saint of Westminster Abbey. And then we get to the end of Great Peter Street, and we're looking at Victoria Tower Gardens. There's the river, and this area of ground here is reclaimed ground from the Victorian period. So that's Edward the Confessor's vision of what we saw. And just to recap, that's it again on a Google map. So we've walked simply around here, there, down there, and across back to the river. And now, just to complete the story, we'll just show you what happens where the current day river meets the Thames. And there's a modern plaque built into the river wall which commemorates the route of the river. And then if you take a boat out onto the river and look back, that at low tide is the outfall of the river. So that's what it looks like today when you get to that end of this actually very significant Victorian engineering project to tame and control the river. Now, I'll conclude by answering my own question. So what did the River Tyburn ever do for us? Well, it gave us epidemiology. It's a lot of insight into the development of the City of London. There's some fine musical connections. There are miasmas and dramas at Buckingham Palace exploited in a popular television series. And we have Edward the Confessor's prestige project leading to the present day siting of the Houses of Parliament. And now I'll leave this page up for a moment or two, and I suggest that I hand back to Kyla, but I'll leave this slide up. Although if you just Google York Unlimited, you will get the information if you do wish to make any donations later.